Jeffrey, let's begin with this question that comes from
right.
Chicago. Wasn't there another women's softball league that played in Chicago during the 40s and 50s besides the All-American Girls Baseball League? Now, that's assuming that people knew that there was the All-American Girls Baseball League. Tell us what the other team was.
Well, okay, so first of all, I think many people do know about the All-American Girls Baseball League because that was the one that was featured in the 1992 movie A League of Their Own. So that's, some people became familiar with it. But yes, there was another women's baseball league in the same era that played only in the Chicago area. So it's funny that it was called the National Girls Baseball League. It formed in 1944, a year after the All-American Girls, and lasted 11 seasons, which was well past World War II, which is interesting because World War II is what gave women a chance to get into pro baseball because so many of the men were off fighting the war. We got a wonderful clip of a 1947 newsreel featuring the National Girls playing. This is from filmmaker Adam Chu, who's making a documentary about the league. So let's take a look.
Here's a new career for women, professional baseball. It's the Bluebirds and the Bloomer Girls. These professional women baseball, not softball players, look like secretaries or stenographers or just good-looking, wholesome girls. Women's baseball is big business and getting bigger and bigger all the time. Although these girls are thoroughly feminine, they play aggressive baseball and get hurt, too, like Bloomer Girls strikeout queen Wildemay Turner with a twisted ankle. Lonnie Stark and Kay Rohrer are tonight's Bluebird battery. One of the league's standout pitchers, Lonnie's got a fast-breaking curve and a back-breaking slow ball. Kay Rohrer switched her evening gowns for, well, I guess you'd call it a chest protector and a catcher's mask. Tonight's game is going to be a pitcher's battle between a blonde and a brunette. The first pitch, and it's a wallop to shortstop, who throws her out at first.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
My goodness, another week already? Well, all right, let's go. Here's the windup, here's the pitch, and greetings, friends. It's Tim Hanlon, your pal, here in podcast land, and of course, it's Good Seats Still Available. Yeah, I can't even say it. That's how excited I am. Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Yeah, that's our little genre that we've carved out for ourselves over the last, 4 years or so of this nonsense. And yeah, you name it. If it's teams, leagues, events, various forms of defunctness or relocations or just out-and-out abandonment, come and gone, we kind of obsess about that kind of stuff. And we welcome you to the proceedings. If you're new, shame on you. Where have you been? So many episodes for you to catch up on. But if you're a return visitor, well, we, of course, appreciate that. And, of course, please indeed tell your friends, and they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on. And we'll keep growing our little defunct and forgotten sports nation here. And this week, we turn our sights back to baseball, but maybe it's softball. We're not quite sure. We kind of get into some of the elements of this as we renew our energies around the women's version of the game, or games, if you will. As most of you probably remember, we've had a couple of conversations around the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. I think that's the entity that most people, if they have any semblance of baseball history and recognize women's participation in the sport over time, will certainly probably know that one, that league, that effort, probably because of the 1990s film A League of Their Own, Tom Hanks and Madonna and Rosie O'Donnell and Gina Davis, et cetera, et cetera. And clearly, lots of great stories still to be unearthed and remembered and rediscovered around the AAGBPL. But what is probably lesser known, and I frankly was completely new to me, was that there at the same time, literally around the same time, almost exactly the same time, with an exception of a year or two, there was actually another separate, distinct women's professional baseball league. It was called the National Girls Baseball League. And despite its name, it was actually headquartered and featured teams solely within the Chicago metropolitan area. It was founded in 1944. It came to its demise about 10 years later. But it's endlessly fascinating. And our guest this week, Adam Chu, who's putting a documentary together about this league, the NGBL, National Girls Baseball League. It was a professional women's baseball league. Now, again, we'll get into some of the specifics of it, but they played with a 12-inch sized ball, which is very much the softball realm we know today. But the name baseball and softball were kind of, liberally confused, shall we say, by both of these leagues. But this one in particular, headquartered and centered in and around Chicago, just had some fascinating topics and pieces of trivia and events attached to it. For example, the chief executive officer for a period of time of this league was a guy named Red Grange. Yeah, the guy who, essentially was known as the Galloping Ghost, star halfback in football for the University of Illinois back in the day, the Chicago Bears. I think he even signed for a cup of coffee with the New York Yankees. I mean, that's how successful and popular and pronounced the sports skills of Red Grange was. It was co-founded by a guy we've talked about previously, too, in our episode number 140 with Joe Ziemba, the Chicago Football Cardinals. The founder of that organization and the co-founder of this National Girls Baseball League, Charles Bidwell. Yeah, he of Chicago Cardinals fame. He, along with Emery Paricci, and were essentially credited as the sort of co-founders of this National Girls Baseball League. A politician by the name of Ed Kulski was sort of also part of that mixture. All of those names and dozens of top talented female baseball / softball players were part of this. And as we'll talk about our conversation with Adam in a few minutes, there was absolutely some trading, shall we say, of talent between these two entities, especially, let's say, the Chicago Colleens of the All-America Girls League. And there was even a truce, if you will, between the two leagues after the first year of their overlap. I think the AAGBPL had a year ahead of the NGBPL, National Girls Baseball League. I'm not going to sort of get you with acronyms, but the National Girls Baseball League was high quality and in some cases even better quality, depending on the historians that you talk to. There were usually around 6 teams in the Chicago area. They played in stadiums all across the city, Forest Park being one of them. They certainly had some exhibitions, a couple of games at Soldier Field. But they played in dedicated parks all around the city. And it's fascinating to sort of understand and recognize just how popular not only the game was generally, but the fact that it had 2 leagues going on simultaneously. And Chicago was this hotbed, this hub. As a matter of fact, Chicago really was a National Girls Baseball League city when the All-America Girls League was out there. The Chicago Colleens didn't even last very long here in Chicago. That's how powerful this league was within the environs of Chicago. Yeah, the All-America League, very much a Midwestern regional kind of approach, despite it also being sort of pitched as sort of a national kind of foundation, national league. But when it came to the city of Chicago, the AAGPBL didn't really have any traction because of what we're going to talk about today with our guest, Adam Chu, the National Girls Baseball League. And yeah, if you remember the teams by the names of the Bloomer Girls and the Rockola Music Maids, how about the Brock's Candy Kids? K with a candy, candy with spelled with a K. Brock's Candy Kids. Paricci was the sponsor of the Bloomer Girls, the Chicago Queens, the Chicago Bluebirds, et cetera, and et cetera. If you're from Chicago, you have relatives from Chicago, or you're just fascinated with another sort of nook and cranny of baseball / softball's history. And then again, softball, right? Hugely popular and becoming more of a thing now as the NCAA and the women's collegiate game now expands to 64 teams for their annual tournament. And you've got now 2 professional endeavors in National Pro Fast Pitch, the women's pro softball league that's been around for a decade or so, and the relatively new Athletes United, the entity that is bringing a very interesting professional format to various women's sports, softball being one of them. And all of that is, frankly, directly lineaged and traceable to our conversation this week around one of the 2 leagues, the probably lesser known softball/baseball league for the women back in the 40s, known as the National Girls Baseball League. Our conversation with Adam Chu coming up in a moment. It's really hugely revealing and just a slice of baseball and women's sports history previously unknown to me and endlessly fascinating. You'll find it the same as well. Before we get there, of course, we've got to go over our little speed bump, right? We've got to pay some bills, keep the lights on, and it's time for air conditioning now that summer is here, and we need that here in our little studio. So help us with those electricity bills as our AC starts to ramp up, will you? By making a purchase from a trio of fine sites. They're all related. It's our pal Kevin Schultz in Florence, Kentucky. It's, I think, a southern suburb of the Cincinnati metropolitan area. 3 great sites for awesome T-shirts, really kind of featuring all kinds of teams and logos, really impossible to find just about anywhere else. And they are in 3 sports: basketball, hockey, and in soccer. Here are the sites that you got to check out. It's VintageIceHockey.com. That's the hockey one. ReboundVintageHoops.com. That's the basketball one. And ExtraTimeVintage.com. That's the soccer one. Yes, you get the word vintage in all of those. And what are you going to get at each of those sites? You're going to find great shirts as well as other apparel featuring a ton of great logos, most of them were unique to these sites. Like, for example, the Columbus Chill on VintageIceHockey.com. Those are not easy to find T-shirts featuring the great Columbus Chill, a previous episode of ours, by the way. East Coast Hockey League, etc. Lots of minor league stuff. We've had a number of conversations about the old Continental Basketball Association and its predecessor, the Eastern Professional Basketball League. If you remember basketball teams and stories from those clubs in places like Altoona, Pennsylvania, for example, ReboundVintageHoops.com has got you covered. That's the place to find all of those and then some. And look, if you're interested in soccer, we've waxed nostalgic about a lot of American Soccer League teams, right? The sort of second, very much forgotten pro league, that was around for decades and trying to professionalize itself even more in the 70s and 80s to take a run at the old NASL. Well, you're going to find a whole bunch of things like the Sacramento Gold, the Columbus Magic, which we just talked about in a previous episode just a week or two ago. ExtraTimeVintage.com is the place for those soccer-oriented shirts and garb. And in each of those sites, ExtraTimeVintage.com, ReboundVintageHoops.com, and VintageIceHockey.com, you can use the promo code GOODSEATS to enjoy, courtesy of us and our pal Kevin Schultz, 10% off all of your purchases. So, what are you waiting for? Check them all out. Bookmark them. There's new stuff being added there all the time. Check out the shirts, check out the logos, and you're going to enjoy, and I'm sure be interested in at least one of those. And again, here are the sites one more time. VintageIceHockey.com for hockey. ReboundVintageHoops.com for basketball or hoops, yeah. And for soccer, ExtraTimeVintage.com. Again, for all those sites, good seats. That's the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you for trying them out. And, of course, thank you as well for continuing to listen. Here's our great conversation coming up right now, coming at you. Here's Adam Chu and me talking about the oft-forgotten National Girls Baseball League. Here it is. Please enjoy. Explain to me where your interest sort of came about for this admittedly sort of forgotten and overlooked league, which is just as important, I think, in the history of women's sports and women in baseball / softball in this country. I'm just curious as to how you came into interest and intrigue. Is it something professional, or did you have a personal relationship with a relative, or just how did you stumble across the story generally in the first place?
Well, I was always a huge baseball fan, and I always love stories about these outlaw leagues that were created, throughout baseball's history that kind of went against the convention of the mainstream leagues. I could tell you stories of the Carolina League, the Outlaw League that used to exist back in the early 1900s. They used to raid Major League Baseball teams. I could tell you about the Federal League. It's just that part of baseball, these outsider leagues that really interest me because, those are the stories that I feel don't get a lot of press just because information is hard to come by. And because the Major League Baseball story has because I want to say they won the war, they are allowed to write the history the way they see fit. So a lot of these stories tend to get swept under the rug or completely forgotten. And when I stumbled upon a Chicago Encyclopedia article about the All-American Girls Baseball League, there was one sentence in there that mentioned the National Girls Baseball League. And once I saw the National Girls Baseball League, I was totally hooked. I started doing the research. I started coming across newspaper articles. Then I began collecting memorabilia for the league. And really, it went hand in hand with what I was studying at college at the time, which was documentary filmmaking. So the one thing that I noticed, was there was very little written down about this league. And that, fueled my passion even further. And when I was researching even more about this league, I would come across articles about certain players and stuff that they had done, previous to softball or during their careers in softball. And these were really remarkable ladies. Some of them were able to get in the Hall of Fames that were created for other sports, like bowling Hall of Fames, basketball Hall of Fames, like individual state Hall of Fames for basketball. And so I felt that, these players' accomplishments needed to be told, and they needed to be further elaborated on than what I could find on the internet, which were certain, maybe 1 or 2 paragraph blurbs about these players, but nothing really concrete about their stories.
So what was it about this particular league that kind of stood out? Because I think most people, who would consider themselves as passing fans of sports generally, right? Pop culture certainly know or think they know the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, right? Which is obviously made into sort of a whole otherworldly thing with a league of their own, that movie from the 1990s that, kind of glamorized all of it, right? And I think most people kind of, if they have any knowledge that there were female, quote unquote, baseball players, and we'll get into the distinction a little while, I'm sure it's part of the story. They think that was kind of it. Oh, sure. I think I remember, or I certainly saw the movie. But this is actually a revelation to me too, right? Was something around the same time and concentrated in the city and the environs of Chicago, which it sounds to me like has just as much a part to play in the telling of the story as it does this league in and of itself. This kind of speaks to Chicago almost as a center of the sport at the same time as this sort of in war and then post-war league for women to play professional sport.
Yeah, and really, when you look into the history of the NGBL, you can't help but talk about the history of softball as well. There's some dispute about where softball was created. Chicago usually is what people believe is where the sport was concentrated and created, thanks to a gentleman by the name of George Hancock, who invented it in 1887. But in 1895, there was a sport very similar to fast-pitch softball you see today that was played in Minnesota that was created by Lois Roberts. So they tend to claim that, they are the center of and the creation of softball's history. But for all intents and purposes, I'm looking at the Chicago side of things. And I believe the sport of softball was invented in Chicago. And when you look at the history, they were pioneers in not only fostering softball, which at the time was known as indoor baseball. So real quick, indoor baseball was a sport that was played usually in a gymnasium. It looked very similar to baseball, but they played with a larger ball, 16-inch diameter, which is very similar to 16-inch softball, which is played currently in Chicago at the moment, and is one of the few cities where that sport is still played.
Yeah, and quick parenthetical, because I think it's important to our non-Chicago listeners. Maybe just a quick detour into that, because that's played with no gloves, and it's a different size ball, and people from outside this area have no clue, nor do they have any semblance of what this is all about.
Yes. So like you said, it's played without gloves. The ball is usually 16 inches in diameter, which is, they almost call it like a cantaloupe or a melon ball. And really what it is it's a sport played usually in rec leagues or just around the playground here in the Chicagoland area. And I think there is a national tournament that was created like in the 1970s that really took the sport kind of beyond the borders, because now there are teams from all over the country that come in and they play in this tournament. But the sport that George Hancock created, it was called indoor baseball. And the story goes that him and a few other members of this boat club known as the Farragut Boat Club were playing, or they were awaiting the scores of the Harvard-Yale football game during Thanksgiving Day in 1887. And they were just horsing around when one of the members threw like a boxing glove at another member, and he managed to see it coming, picked up like a broomstick and hit it back at the gentleman that threw it at him. So George Hancock had seen this, and that's when he started to organize the people on the gymnasium so they could play a game similar to baseball with this boxing glove and this broomstick on the gymnasium floor. And then after that, he wrote a bunch of rules for the game, and he ended up publishing them. And it kind of started the ball rolling for indoor baseball to become a sport, mostly in the Chicagoland area. Now, at the time, there weren't really very many indoor sports. I think, I'm not sure when basketball was invented, but I believe it was just a little bit after this. So when indoor baseball started gaining momentum, a lot of athletes looked at it as a way to stay in shape, during the winter months. So indoor baseball kind of took a hold in the Chicagoland area and eventually branched out from there. And in 1892, I found an article mentioning how some people had adapted the game for outdoor use. And they began to play the game outdoors with a ball that was a little bit harder than the one that was used in indoor baseball. So in indoor baseball, the ball tended to be a little bit soft just because, you don't want to hit a hard ball indoors because the potential for injury was, enormous. And so they began to adapt the game outdoors with this harder ball and a harder baseball bat than used indoors. And eventually the game started to flourish between, being an indoor sport and an outdoor sport. Now that in 1895, though, that's when Lois Roberts created his version of softball. But I still honestly believe, though, that, this 1887 year was the year that the sport of softball was created, because George Hancock's version kind of influenced later how the game would be played.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's a tributary to the sport of quote unquote softball in and of itself, right? And I'm sure we could do a whole nother episode sort of devoted to sort of the quote unquote split or the divergence or the parallelism, I guess, of these two sort of different versions. Obviously, the latter version you describe or hint at obviously becomes the more, shall we call it, universal one. But I guess in Chicago, right, you probably had the best of both worlds, because both versions were, I'm sure, flourishing and had their own sort of pluses and minuses. Maybe use that sort of as the setup for maybe why the sport generally became quite a sensation. Certainly the outdoor version. We could talk about sort of the indoor continuation of that too, because I think it's really important to kind of set that up as a backdrop for what ultimately became a large talent pool in the 40s when both of these professional leagues started to come about. Women and the game of softball were quite the thing in the first part of the latter century, right? This was a huge sport, certainly played on an amateur level, and not just uniquely to women either, by the way.
Yes. And really, if you look at the history as well of softball, the first women's softball team was formed in 1895 at high school here in Chicago, known as West Division High School. And they didn't get a formal league, though, for women until 1901. But almost from the beginning, though, women were allowed to play this game. I'm not sure exactly about the history of women in baseball, but I've heard that a lot of people believe that the sport of baseball was a little too rough for women. So when this kind of, came about, women were encouraged to play almost from the beginning. And really, after 1901, there was no other league at the scholastic level, but women were allowed to play intramural and playground versions of the game all the way up until the 1930s. And really, the fact that they were included at the beginning of the sport sort of tells you why it was so popular once, the entire rule set was adopted for softball in 1933 that kind of codified all these different versions that had been played all across the United States. It brought together all these organizations that were playing these various versions of softball. And that's when the Amateur Softball Association was created, and it kind of fostered, the participation of both men and women in the sport all the way leading up to the present, actually.
So maybe set the table now for the professionalism in women playing this game. Call it softball, call it baseball. We'll talk about sort of the differences, so to speak, from its label in a minute. But maybe set the table a little bit. Obviously, the early 40s was when the war was raging here in the United States. There were a lot of players in baseball being drafted or volunteering. Football, we know, certainly in some previous episodes, the NFL was, not unaffected either. But entrepreneurial, interestingly, men with this idea of sort of keeping sports alive a bit, using women to play a game somewhat familiar and a distraction from the war effort and other stuff. An interesting set of circumstances.
Yes. And it really starts in the early 40s and late 30s, why professionalism eventually became the norm. Softball was really sort of, I want to say, not well organized in a lot of cities. So, because the ladies were amateurs, they weren't given contracts. So there was a lot of talent rating. And I think in around the early 1940s, 1941 and 1942, some issues about getting paid started coming into the norm. And when William Wrigley, who had ballparks in Los Angeles and Chicago, and of course the Cubs and the Los Angeles Angels, in which he owned, there were strong softball leagues in both cities. So they were using his ballparks. And I'm pretty sure once he had this belief in his head that, there weren't going to be men around to play Major League Baseball or minor league baseball, he looked at this as sort of as an alternative, simply because these ladies were drawing crowds in his ballparks in these cities. And then
you're saying they already established, and I'm sure you're going to hint at this too with the quote unquote other league. There was already in the Chicago area quite an attraction to this play already, albeit at an amateur level.
Yes.
Wow.
And the league was known as the Metropolitan Girls Softball League, and they had been around since the 1930s, and they were thriving. I think they played in maybe like 4 ballparks, and they were drawing numbers that were better than the men's softball teams and oftentimes better than the White Sox and sometimes the Cubs. So when these ladies were given the opportunity to play professional baseball, when William Wrigley wanted to start this professional league in 43, I mean, they jumped at the chance. They weren't getting any of the profits from, the attendance that was at their games. I mean, they were amateur. Some of them might have gotten a job out of the deal that they had with the amateur team owners, or they might have been paid under the table. But a lot of times these ladies weren't paid. So to play this game professionally and to get paid was something that really attracted a lot of them. And once they signed with the All-American Girls Baseball League, I mean, those amateur leagues teams were decimated.
Interesting. It speaks to the fact that there were so many talented women playing the game, but it also speaks to the fact that there's a monetary incentive to at least foundationally create the idea that maybe there could be a quote-unquote business around this for people like Wrigley and his ilk for this league.
Yeah, and that's funny too, because he didn't talk to anyone within the softball community about starting this league. They were very much independent, so he had his own people create the league. So once that began, a lot of the previous owners of amateur teams decided that it was time for them to start paying their players, because they didn't like the fact that now all their great players were playing in this league that had nothing to do with them, didn't even bother or give them the courtesy to talk to them about, starting up this league. So, they were a little mad. So I think they relished in that opportunity to try to get back at William Wrigley for that. And if you look at one man in particular, his name is Emery Parashee.
Oh, yeah.
He was one of the founders of the league. Yeah, so he was one of the founders of the league, along with Charlie Bidwell and a gentleman named Ed Kolsky. They had all been sponsoring amateur softball teams in the Chicagoland area for years. I think Emery started in 1937 and Charlie Bidwell around that same time as well. Ed Kolsky, he was a former baseball player who also played softball, and he sort of made it a family affair, starting a team that starred his sister, who was one of the best softball players or would become one of the best softball players in the NGBL. So these 3 men had the idea to create this league in Chicago. And it's funny because the league, they began talks in May and were formed like within a week later, and then began playing in June. So that's how spontaneous, the National Girls Baseball League was. But these men had been involved in softball for a long time, so they really had infrastructure in place already. And I think when they announced that they were going to begin to pay the players or turn professional, a few other owners got on board, but there was also a little bit of a mixed reaction from some other people within the softball community who didn't like the idea of another professional league taking more talent and thus decimating the amateur leagues even further. And the amateur league managed to last like up until the early 1950s, but really it was almost a domino effect. It was one by one they started going under. And eventually, outside of the West Coast, there were very few amateur leagues left on the East because of these 2 professional leagues that had started. And the funny thing, too, is that they weren't the only professional league. There was also another one in the New York metropolitan area that started around 1946. It started off as the American Girls Softball League. And then they, like the All-American League, changed from playing softball to playing a modified version of baseball. And they also took a lot of talent.
So, okay, it would seem to me, to the outsider, that Parashee and Bidwell would have been the guys to go to if I were Wrigley trying to set up a league, right? Because these are the guys who had essentially been the patrons of women's softball, at least on the amateur level, for years, at least in Chicago, right?
Yes. And the fact that he didn't, I think that's why there was so much animosity in the softball community at him, because he didn't go to these people who already have the know-how. and already have sort of the infrastructure in place on how to start a professional league. And if you ever notice throughout the history of the All-American Girls Baseball League, they tried to put a team in Chicago for 1 year in 1948. It was called the Chicago Colleens, and that team didn't do well, and that was the only year they played. And it was because of the National Girls Baseball League. They were so dominant in the Chicagoland area. I mean, you could watch some of the top players in all of softball play in this league. And in my opinion, I believe the better game was being played in the National Girls Baseball League because of the caliber of player that they had. And so the Colleens were never able to get a foothold. And I think the All-American League throughout their history tried to do things to try to kind of end that dominance. I mean, they created like a 4-team minor league that was solely based in Chicago that had teams playing 2 in Chicago and then 2 in Blue Island, Illinois. But they were never to crack, the foothold that the National Girls Baseball League had in Chicago.
So that's really interesting. That is lost, I think, in a lot of people, that Chicago was not really part of the All-American Girls circuit for this very reason. It's almost like there's like a fortress around the Chicago metro area when it comes to the game and the evolution of both of these leagues.
Yes, and then it's funny, too, though, because the National Girls Baseball League wasn't able to get any sort of momentum outside of the city of Chicago as well. I think in 48, they tried to expand beyond the Chicagoland area, and it was unsuccessful. They were never able to get more than 6 teams in the league. They started off with 5 teams in 44, and then 6 teams from 45 all the way to 52, but they were never able to get any more than that. And I think it's because they also wanted to keep the monopoly on Chicago, so they didn't have the foresight, though, to try to expand outside of the city. And that's kind of what led to their downfall, because Chicago wasn't able to support, this league further than the mid-1950s, because there were too many entertainment options, especially with Major League Baseball now being a regular thing on television. Fans didn't have to leave their home. They could watch baseball, and a super high quality of baseball at home, which led to the attendance downfall for the National Girls Baseball League.
All right. So before we get into the baseball versus softball description thing, because I think it's important to kind of distill it, can we talk a little bit about the 3 guys behind the National League? You mentioned 2 of them. Well, you actually mentioned all 3 of them. Emery Parachi, right, is obviously a big part of it. Charlie Bidwell, most listeners to this show will remember our conversation with Joe Ziemba talking about the Chicago Cardinals, episode number 140, of which Bidwell was a major part because he was the owner of that team. And this Ed Kalski guy, he's a politician, right? So maybe a little bit about the 3 of them and sort of maybe how this came together, because I got to think the All-American League pushed them to action. Maybe they weren't even considering professionalizing what they had.
Yes, and Emery Parachi, he is probably one of the big catalysts for this league. He was all for paying the ladies for years. And he had, in fact, when he was only sponsoring a softball team in Forest Park, Illinois, he built them a ballpark, which was known as one of the nicest ballparks at the time that softball had played in. And it was located at the corner of Harlem and Harrison in Forest Park, and it was a jewel. It had a baseball museum that was attached to it. And now this baseball museum was something that Emery had created in the 1930s, and it was the first baseball museum to ever exist in the United States, and it predated the National Baseball Hall of Fame, I believe, by 5 years. So I think in 1934 is when he created this baseball museum. And so he made Parachi Memorial Stadium sort of the center of softball in the Chicagoland area. And I know when the Amateur Softball Association used to run the World's Amateur Softball Championships, that was the only ballpark outside of Chicago that hosted games during the tournament, and eventually became known as Girls Softball Town USA, because there were so many women's games, amateur, professional, exhibition games being played at this ballpark by women that they had no other choice but to call it that. And so Emery, he was a roofing company owner, and he was really a huge fan of the women. Whenever I do an interview with any of the ladies that played in the league who also played for Emery, they talk about him as being like one of the most generous people on the planet, because he was so accommodating to the women. He was always giving them bonuses. I believe he was one of the major promoters behind the National Girls Baseball League. So really, he was the one putting out publications about the league. He was the one who was paying the players sometimes the highest salaries. One of the players that he had on the team her name was Wildemay Turner. He signed her in 1946 to a contract of $5,500 for 14 weeks that the league played during the summer months. And at the time, that was the highest paid female athlete in the United States. And so he was really the probably the one that a lot of women will remember, because when the league ended, he also was the one that tried to keep it going for a few more years. He purchased all the teams in 1953 and tried to continue the league even after they had shut down officially in 1954. He only had 2 teams left by 1955, but he wanted to keep playing, and he was willing to fund that out of his own pocket just to keep them playing. And then you go to Charlie Bidwell. Bidwell, he was a huge softball booster in the 1930s. So he sponsored teams on the west suburbs, and he wanted to expand his sporting empire. And like you said, he was the owner of the Chicago Cardinals, and he also owned a few racetracks here in the Chicagoland area. So he got his right-hand man, Arch Wolf, involved, and they were able to get the ball rolling when the National Girls Baseball League was brought up about, turning professional and being created. And he was one of the major financiers in the league. So a lot of the other teams needed sponsors in order to survive. But because of his resources, he didn't need a sponsor. So the team that he owned, the Chicago Bluebirds, never had a sponsor attached to their name. But I think the part where he died in 1940, I want to say 47 or 48. I can't remember off the top of my head, but when he died, sort of that empire started crumbling, and you could see the Bluebirds were one of the top teams in the league, but they kind of regressed after that. They still had a lot of the top players, but they weren't able to continue to play at a high level simply because they weren't. There wasn't anyone like Charlie Bidwell devoted to the team. And then Ed Kolsky, I've spoken with members of his family, and they really aren't privy to a lot of the stuff that he was involved in, but they would describe him to me like he was almost like a mafioso boss, which is kind of hilarious because if you look at the pictures of him, he sort of does fit that mold. And then he was very old school, and he was involved in softball almost early on, simply because his sister was such a great talent in the game. And so he kind of wanted to, I don't know if he wanted to market her or he saw the ability to make money with her. So he would create these amateur softball teams for his sister to play on. And they were some of the most successful teams in the Metropolitan Softball League. And to jump at the chance, to recoup some of the losses that he had gotten when Wrigley created his pro league, and not only to promote his sister, but also to promote a lot of the businesses that he would be involved in, he jumped at the chance to join the National Girls Baseball League. And his team was probably the best team in the league throughout its entire existence. And really, he wasn't a politician until after his days playing softball, but like I said before, he was able to bring people to the table that wouldn't have normally gotten into softball. A lot of the sponsors that he got to be the sponsors of his team, they were eventually big contributors to his political aspirations. And so I think Ed Kolsky was just a very smooth operator and a very clever person. And he, like I said, he didn't have the resources of the other owners, but he was an amazing talker. He was very charismatic. For the longest time, he was the one that they would send to deal with the public if there was anything that needed to be said about the league in general.
Interesting, very interesting, and I'm just fascinated by the fact that these sort of two leagues were going on simultaneously, and how Chicago was, sort of unique and inured to the All-American thing, but you can hear why, right? I mean, these are three local guys, right, who were involved in the sport, right, prior to the professionalism thing. Let's ask you the question now. Baseball versus softball, like the differences between the two leagues. What about that? And what about these two descriptors? Because was it baseball? I think the All-American League had a bit more, quote unquote, baseball deferences to it than, say, the National League did.
Yes. And the All-American League was really the one that made the sport look a lot similar to baseball, because when they came in, softball was still played 10 people aside on the field. So that meant there was your entire infield, the shortstop, but they also had what they called a short infielder who played between the first baseman and the second baseman. So when the All-American League came in, they made it 9, and that's where the sport kind of focused after that. It suddenly became 9 to a side, as opposed to the 10 that had previously been around. And then the All-American League, the first year they played softball, but then throughout their history, you see every year they changed the rules, and it started resembling more baseball towards the end. The National Girls Baseball League, they were softball from the beginning to the end. So that meant, the 12-inch underhand, as opposed to the All-American League, which started with the 12-inch softball and then eventually got to the 9-inch baseball. And they started out with the underhand fast pitch, but eventually the All-American League evolved to having the overhand pitch. And then the differences between softball, like I said before, in the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of people were playing and stealing other leagues. It wasn't until 1933, when the Amateur Softball Association started, that they were able to codify the rules to make it an actual organized sport. And they were playing with the Chicago rules. So that's another reason why, you could honestly argue that Chicago was the center of softball, because of its influence on the game. And then the All-American League, what's really funny is that there were players that went from both leagues back and forth. A lot of the players, though, who had grown up as softball players, didn't like the fact that the leagues was changing the rules year in and year out. So a lot of them couldn't adapt to the overhand pitch. A lot of them felt that their arms were going to give out if they kept adding feet to the baselines. And so the National Girls Baseball League, who did not change the rules at all during their time, was a better option for them.
That's interesting. So why? Why then? Why did the National League then still keep the name baseball then?
Well, the first 2 years that they played, 44 and 45, they were called the National Girls Softball League. But for some reason, I think there was this distinction that softball was being played with a soft ball. So they wanted to really kind of show the public that this was sort of a variation of baseball. So they're going to call it girls' version of baseball. Now, if you look at basketball, they had a variation of basketball that was played only by women, I think, in the Midwest, called 6-on-6 basketball. So I think this was kind of naming it girls baseball was kind of a way to differentiate themselves from being played or regular baseball being played, and against the name softball, to kind of show the fans that this is a version of baseball being played that's only played by women, sort of like 6-on-6 basketball, that wouldn't confuse the fans. So when fans come to the ballpark, they think, oh, you know, this looks like baseball. So this is the girls' version of baseball.
It's really interesting how the words softball and baseball were used interchangeably for both of these leagues and this sort of period of time.
Okay. So the National Girls Baseball League was actually called the National Girls Softball League. Their first 2 years of their existence in 44 and 45. I believe that they changed the name from softball to baseball in 46 was based solely on the term softball being misleading, I think, to the general public. I think they felt that fans were kept away because they thought that they were going to see a game played with a much softer ball than a baseball. So the leagues thought the term baseball might have been more promotable, and it was sort of to differentiate themselves from the other leagues that were in the area, solely the Metropolitan League and other softball leagues that played in the west suburbs. And I also believe they were trying to sell the public on this term of girls baseball being a variation of the sport of baseball. So the fans were able to, you know, come with this frame of reference that this is baseball that they're watching, except it's just a much, I don't want to say lesser, but I think that's their mindset, a much lesser version of the game of baseball. So they termed it girls baseball instead of softball.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it was pejorative per se, but, you know, in retrospect, it looks like it could be a little sexist perceived, but maybe not. Maybe it was just simply a way to create a relatable product. And let's remind the audience that this was professional product, really, against two leagues, right?
Yes. And the All-American Girls, I mean, they weren't known as the All-American Girls Baseball League throughout their entire existence. I think they had like maybe 4 or 5 name changes to their history as well. They started out as the All-American Girls Softball League. So, you know, they were also trying to bring in that baseball audience. And so, you know, that's when fans were able to see the hybrid version of baseball and softball that they were able to see at the All-American League parks.
Okay, well, let's get into some of these teams in a second. But before we do that, let's talk about the very famous person that was sort of corralled to be, what, commissioner or CEO or something to draw attention.
So that was Red Grange, and he was the commissioner in 1947. And the funny thing is, the league had been following the All-American Girls Baseball League's hiring of Max Carey, who was a former baseball star, as their league commissioner. So I think they wanted to counteract that announcement with their own announcement that they had this big star, this big male star from another sport as their commissioner. And really, you know, Harold Red Grange, he didn't have any power whatsoever. The league was still being run by Bidwell, Kolsky, and Parashee. So he was just merely there as a public face. But I don't think he did anything other than show up at league meetings and show up for photo ops. And the connection, though, with him was through Charlie Bidwell. And I think Bidwell really was the one that convinced Red Grange that this is something that he should have done.
So what's Grange do? He's kind of like just the figurehead and kind of goes out and sort of cuts ribbons and shakes hands and takes pictures and stuff?
Yeah, pretty much. He didn't really have any power. The suspensions were all through Ed Kolsky, because Ed Kolsky was the president at the time. And so I think Red, aside of a few photo ops, I mean, I have no records of him being involved whatsoever with the day-to-day operation of the league. So his title as commissioner was more or less for the public's sake, I guess.
Well, and obviously legendary, certainly in the Midwest, Illinois, and Chicago proper, for sure, right? So not a bad guy to sort of have, you know, drawing some attention, right?
But it was sort of an odd choice, though. I mean, he was a football person, although at the time he'd been trying other things. I think I've read articles about him like trying to become like some sort of boxing promoter. But Red Grange really, I mean, it was an odd choice because they did have former major leaguers involved in the National Girls Baseball League. So, I mean, they could have hired any one of those people, and maybe given them a little more of a role in the day-to-day operations as opposed to Red Grange, because I don't think, it might have brought some eyes to the product, but I really don't think it did much for the league overall.
I sense that a gentleman by the name of C.C. Pyle was sort of part of the mixture, too. That was his agent for a long time. And we've even done an episode on C.C. Pyle's amazing foot races that he ran, cross-country foot races, right? And Grange was kind of sort of part of the promotional around that, too. So, yeah, I mean, this is sort of, I wouldn't call it hucksterism, but it's certainly a lot of promotion, shall we say. Sports promotion was certainly in its infancy, and maybe not to be too surprising when you look back at it.
Yeah, and I think, too, the National Girls Baseball League began showing games on television. So in 1947, I believe that was the first year that they started showing games on television. And I really honestly believe that Red Grange was hired for that very reason. They wanted a few more eyeballs on the product. So, here's Red Grange's star as your commissioner, and maybe you can get a soundbite out of him every now and again on the TV. But really, I think that's why his hiring was so instrumental.
Were you able to find any television footage or any film footage from a broadcast or two in your search?
Unfortunately, no. There was a thing called Kinescoping back in the day that they used to do for television where, they would place a camera in front of a TV and record what was being played on the camera, or I'm sorry, what was being recorded on the television. But unfortunately, I don't believe anyone has saved any of those games simply because television studios would record over the reels that they had simply to save money. I have managed to find, though, footage from family members who had maybe a camera on hand and recorded some of the games, but no, none of the professional quality games have ever been found, which is unfortunate because I would have loved to have seen some of the broadcasts, because I guess instead of doing the over-the-shoulder center field camera, they used to put the camera above the field so you would see the entire field.
Interesting. Yeah, and the kinescope thing, right? It bedeviled the television industry for decades even after that. Johnny Carson fans will tell you that. How about some of the teams? In particular, a little bit of the history of this Bloomer girls team, because they were kind of sort of a showcase, I think, in some respects, and they actually weren't even a Chicago team, if I have that right.
Yes, and the history of the Bloomer girls team was interesting because they started out in Chicago. So in 1933, 1924, I'm sorry, I totally messed that up. Let me try that again. So in 1924, a man by the name of Hubert Baumgartner, who was a former baseball player, and his father, Ed Baumgartner, started the Bloomer girls team. And it sort of was the first formal women's softball team, I think, in a long time in the Chicagoland area, because, there was playground teams, but there were really no teams that played, exhibition games. And they were, in fact, former baseball people who started playing the game of indoor baseball and felt that there was that lack of women's teams because there were so many talented players in the Chicagoland area. So when they started the team in 1924, they were fairly successful. They were really popular, and they named the team Bloomer Girls after the Bloomer Girl baseball teams that used to exist in the early half of the 1900s. And they kind of were playing off, Alta Weiss and I forget the other name. She used to have a team called the Devil Dogs.
Yeah, they're all barnstorming, essentially, right?
Yeah, so they were barnstorming teams. And so the Bloomer girls were kind of like the barnstorming women's team in the Chicagoland area. But it wasn't until 1933, they went to a gentleman by the name of Matt Rupert, who was a real famous softball player here in the Chicagoland area, who had his own softball association. Now, at the time, individual players would create their own softball associations as sort of a showcase for not only them, but also if there was disagreements between them and the National Association. So Matt Rupert began sponsoring the team, and I think that really elevated them to another level, because then they started playing games at Chicago Stadium. They started playing games around the United States, and they became fairly popular. So then after Matt Rupert was sponsoring the team, I think he kind of lost influence in the Chicagoland area. So the Bloomer Girls were really left without a sponsor. So they decided they could find a better sponsor in the west suburbs. And that's when they moved to Forest Park, Illinois. And they managed to find a sponsor called Vogel's, who owned a bowling alley, which was across the street from the ballpark that they played at. So in 1935, the Vogel Bloomer Girls were formed. When Vogel's was trying to ouster the Baumgartners from managing the team, well, they got rid of the Vogels as a sponsor, and that's where Emery Parisi comes in. He became the sponsor, and that's when he built the stadium for the team. And then eventually in 1942, when the Baumgartners wanted to end their association with softball and with the Bloomer Girls, rose to prominence because he really put a lot into not only the stadium, but also the team. And they became one of the top teams in the area at the time.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, but did Parisi, did he also, were these teams independently owned, or were they kind of centrally owned by the quote unquote league?
A lot of the teams that started in 1944 were independently owned. It wasn't until later, like in 1953, when the league started going under, that's when Parisi started purchasing the other clubs in the league and kind of kept it afloat until 1955, which is kind of funny because a lot of the teams, they were really strong in the early parts of their existence, so like the first 4 years, but then they had a really odd way of divvying up the stadiums in the league. So like 1 year, let's say 3 teams would have a home stadium, but they would be playing out of 6 stadiums. The next year, maybe 4 teams would have a home stadium, and then 2 would be like kind of the traveling teams. So they really didn't give any of the teams any opportunities, you know, to really kind of make their own money. So a lot of the teams started running into financial problems, and eventually they would get sold. The name would get changed, and it was a revolving door after that of owners, with only like Parisi's team, Bidwell's team, and Kolsky's team, and to a lesser extent the Music Maids, who eventually changed owners halfway through their existence in the National Girls Baseball League. Those 4 teams were kind of the more stable teams, but the other 2 were struggling almost year in and year out after 47.
And would I be correct in assuming that maybe some of the more marquee games and or events were played at Soldier Field and Wrigley Field, while the other ones were kind of just spread all over the metropolitan area?
Well, they only played maybe 2 games at Wrigley and I think 1 game at Soldier Field, which is an odd choice to me because that's where the World Amateur Softball Tournament was held every year that they played in Chicago. So I think from 1933 all the way to 1934 to 1939. So there are publications of the players playing at Soldier Field and a few pictures of them at Wrigley Field. But really, I think simply for the fact that, you know, Wrigley was owned by William Wrigley, they didn't play many games at those ballparks. Same with, I don't know why they completely avoided Comiskey Park, but no games were played there. And if they played a game outside of any of the parks that they played at, you know, it was usually an exhibition game on a playground somewhere.
Interesting. So, but it looks like they were still drawing crowds at these various places. Like Bidwell had a stadium down on 75th Street. You had the Rockola Stadium on the north side, North Central, 4200 block. The Gill Stadium, Lane Stadium. I mean, these are all sort of, I'm guessing though, not gigantic facilities, but big enough to hold some decent crowds.
Yeah, they were on average. They were like 2,500 people. They used to be amateur baseball stadiums that were converted to softball fields. The league was drawing well, but the stadiums, I mean, you would get knocked down all the time. So I think consistently the only stadiums that they played at were Shrewbridge Field and Parachute Stadium in Forest Park. The other stadiums, they were used by 16-inch softball clubs. They were used by amateur baseball teams. They were used by, I think, soccer clubs as well. So, they got a lot of use out of them, but I don't believe they got the best dates, which might have led to why they were never given home stadiums, a lot of the teams. So when the league started going under in the mid-1950s, you can watch like a lot of the photographs or the footage that I have, and you can see that there's very little people in the stands, which is kind of crazy because if you look at photos from 47 to 1952, you see that stands are packed. I mean, there was almost sellouts every night, and they didn't play a very harsh schedule. I mean, they would play games every night, but I mean, because it's only 7 innings, they could hold multiple games at one ballpark, and the fans would get their fill. And 2,500 people watching a doubleheader of 7 innings each. I mean, that was a big drawing sport in Chicago, especially considering a lot of the times that, this was still around wartime. So, gasoline might have been scarce and people might not be able to travel, from park to park or to travel, long distances to be able to see these ladies play. But the fact that they were able to draw such great crowds, I mean, that's a testament to the quality of the sport or the quality of the play that was in the National Girls Baseball League.
Well, maybe some for the players, too, because they were probably fresher because they didn't have to travel on buses like they did in the All-American Girls League.
Yes. And the funny thing, too, about that is I think that was written in a lot of their contracts was, they get paid a higher amount as long as they're able to find their own way to the ballpark. And so when the ladies, I mean, they didn't have any problem, getting like 4 people into a car and traveling to the stadium. And the stadiums, within, a couple miles of each other sometimes. So they were able to, have, like you said, they were able to be fresher. They were able to have a lot of the amenities that they wouldn't normally have at some of these ballparks. And also it was just a great neighborhood ballparks that, the players eventually became part of that neighborhood. So it was no problem, if you saw one of your neighbors come down to the ballpark and watch you play, because it was for the most part, a lot of the players said it was a fun time. They had fun playing, and a lot of the fans had fun playing, and they really got into the games. I mean, they would throw stuff at the players that they didn't like, which is kind of harsh, because, that's something that's frowned upon nowadays. But I guess these were very hostile environments, though, when the visiting team would come to these ballparks and play these games.
So the dynamic between these two leagues, right, was contentious, certainly at the beginning, but near the end of both of their lives around the same time, it looks like they even sort of coordinated an actual off-season league between them.
Mm-hmm. So that was the
International Girls Baseball League in Miami.
Yes. And it's funny that you mentioned that because I've read the article that Mary Fiddler, I think is her name, wrote for the SABR. And I saw that they did not mention the fact that in 1947, the All-American Girls Baseball League and the National Girls Baseball League were kind of cooperating to send players down to Florida to play for sort of an independent women's softball team called the Miami Beach Kennel Club Greyhounds. Now, this team was owned by Charlie Bidwell, and he owned dog racetracks in Illinois, and he owned dog racetracks down in Florida. So what he would do is he would get some of the top players from the National Girls Baseball League and a few of the players from the All-American Girls Baseball League who were allowed to come down and work in his dog racetracks while also training and playing softball. So I think in 47, that laid the groundwork for Meyerhoff, the All-American Girls Baseball League, to, come up with the idea of maybe they should create a winter league in 48. And then Frank Darling wanting to create a winter league in 1949. So when they got to 1952 and 53, I think the reason the International Girls Baseball League was created was for the simple fact that they had to open up a new market, because I think they saw the writing was on the wall in the Midwest as far as, these two sports leagues existing past, the mid 1950s. So when they had this very ambitious plan to play all these games in Florida, they really were desperate at the time, and they needed anything that they could do to try to keep this alive. But I think, if I am correct, I'm not too keen on the International Girls Baseball League, simply because, there was so much I could not find about the league. And my point of reference is that SABR article about the league. So I'm not too sure why the All-American League eventually kind of, moved away from it. And it was simply more or less a National Girls Baseball League run winter league. But also, too, I don't understand how between 49 and 1952-53 that there was no other winter league for these ladies.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we've had a couple of conversations that maybe skirted on the idea of some of the ladies going to play in Cuba, even to be fresh, right? So, but that sounds very unofficial, so to speak, versus it being approved, if you will, by either of these leagues.
Yeah, and I felt that it was more or less they signed the agreement not to rate each other's talents in 46, but I think they were still kind of weary of each other. There was still a little animosity and hurt feelings on both sides. So, they really couldn't work together, I felt, before that, because of the rule changes and because of the animosity and because of, their fears of players playing for the other league and totally messing up the contracts that they had signed. So this International Girls Baseball League it's really remarkable that it was able to get off the ground. But like I said, though, in 47, though, there was an attempt. And for all intents and purposes, it was pretty successful, the Winter League team in 47. And I didn't see any player rating after that. None of the players switched sides. So I don't understand why it took them that long, to create that Winter League, especially since a lot of the players, they knew each other. So it was only natural, that these two leagues should start working together at some point, whether it be on anything.
Yeah, it's also interesting, too, because it's also near the end of both of their natural lives, right? Because, there are various reasons for that, right? The 50s, the war sort of halo, if you call it that, the effect was kind of over. Television, baseball fans were watching a lot of baseball on television, and there was a lot of boom time economically and stuff. So maybe it was a last-ditch effort of some sort, maybe to kind of join or test the waters, to join forces to kind of solidify, I guess, what had been going on for the last number of years. But, these things come to an end, I guess. I got two more questions for you. Number one, how about some names of players that kind of stood out in your research? We don't have to get too in-depth, but some names that maybe should be worth remembering as standout players in this league. Any come to mind?
Yeah, there's a ton, actually. But I'll give you a few. Freda Savona, she was considered the greatest player of her generation, playing in the All-American Girls Baseball League simply because she didn't fit their idea of feminine beauty, which was unfortunate because she was, in fact, a really amazing player. A lot of the players say that, she would do this thing before the games where she would put a bucket at home plate, and from the warning track of whatever ballpark she was in, she would throw a softball and get it right into the bucket that was placed at, home plate, which to the crowds, this was amazing that there was this girl that was able to do that. And she ended up becoming single season home run leader in the NGBL. And she was also hitting around like 450 her entire career in the NGPL. And eventually she became a manager along with another lady. Her name is Wildemay Turner. She was probably the best pitcher in the league's history. And she had, according to her nephew, she had an ERA of .016. And I found a few newspaper clippings as well that kind of attest to that. So she was rather remarkable. And she signed in 46. And she was another lady that eventually became a manager in the league. There was Lois Roberts. She was from Los Angeles, probably one of the faster players in the league and one of the top hitters. And she is remarkable because she played the entire game barefoot. I mean, she had started playing in the mid-1930s, and throughout her entire career, she was barefoot. She even played American football in the Los Angeles area barefoot. So she's another remarkable player. Betty Chapman was, she broke the color barrier. She was hired by the Music Maids in 1950, Black American, to play professional softball in the United States. And I think she only played 1 year, but if the statistics that I uncovered are any indication of how good she was one of the best hitters in the league. She was hitting upwards of 350 at certain points during the season. So she was rather remarkable. Another player is Lonnie Stark. She was the top pitcher on the Bluebirds team. She had won numerous softball awards throughout her career. She was a top player in the amateur ranks even before she joined the NGPL. And the fact that she played almost the entire 11 seasons that the National Girls Baseball League existed, while also having played about 5 or 6 years of amateur softball before that, shows you just how good she was. She was an amazing pitcher. Before Wildemay Turner showed up, she was the top pitcher in the league. And then her and Wilda kind of traded that accolade between themselves, for the next, I want to say 9 years. So they were rather remarkable players in the league. There's so many others that I could think of. There were players that played in the All-American League, like Connie Wisniewski and Audrey Wagner. There was Tony Ann Palermo. There was Irma Bergman, who also played in the All-American League. There was a player named Pat Carson, who was one of the top home run hitters, and was actually, her and Freda Savona were kind of the most feared combination in the league. They both played for the Queens. There was also Alice Kolsky, who was Ed Kolsky's sister, who won the MVP award for the league in 44.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure she was good too, yeah.
There was Ann Komezic. She is another pitcher who the Queens had signed. And really, if you look at the history, the Queens were the most dominant team in the league. I think from 1950 to 1952, they won 3 titles in a row, and it was because of the caliber player. And Ann was one of their top pitchers. Betty Evans was another player. She came from the Portland area, and she was another Queen pitcher that was just dominant in the league. So really, there's so many remarkable players. And what bothers me most about, my project, I started in 2009. So when I was still in college, but by that time, so many of these players had passed away, which is rather sad because, there are a lot of things about the league that I don't know about. And really, I feel it's because I wasn't able to interview these ladies, which kind of disappoints me because there is so much of the league that I still don't know about. And that kind of bothers me because I like to be thorough with my research, and to not have these players, opinions and experiences on hand, I'm not sure if I'll be doing them justice with this documentary.
Yeah, and that lack of dwindling of first person accounts, right? You can say this for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League and the remaining folks who were part of that. It seems that at least a decade or so, maybe even longer before, there was a real effort by some Herculean effort, right, by a number of folks to kind of get as much oral history in the book, so to speak, as possible. And really, the movie not hurting the process, Ken Burns' baseball not hurting the process, right? But you wonder, especially since this was such a local league in Chicago, that, that there is just a dearth of that kind of first person memory anymore left to kind of, get and document.
Yeah, and I really think it has to do with the fact that it was softball. The All-American Girls Baseball League did a great job of throwing their lot in with baseball, organized baseball. And, women's softball history, until recently, there really hasn't been much of an account into women's softball history. But before that, there was such a dearth of information. I think it has to do a lot with, the barnstorming aspect of a lot of the women's softball teams. And also the fact that this was simply a Chicago-centric league. And so a lot of people, even though they were nationally televised at certain points, a lot of people still don't know much about this league. And then, individual Hall of Fames, like the Amateur Softball Association had a Hall of Fame, but they only would induct amateur players or college softball players or players who played for the national team. So, they have no inclination to want the professional ranks of their sport involved in their Hall of Fame. And then, the National Baseball Hall of Fame doesn't want them because they played softball. So it really is kind of disappointing that, people would take this approach, especially since the All-American League and the National Girls Baseball League traded so many players back and forth. That, I felt that at least they could have acknowledged, both leagues at the same time. And even the other leagues that existed at the time, like the American Girls Baseball Conference. So it's kind of a sad hand that they were dealt, because their history was not formally written down, and there wasn't really an effort to include them in anyone else's history, even though they had very much a shared history.
All right. Well, that leads me to my last question, and it does sort of touch on this, and we kind of obsess about sort of this particular part of most of our explorations. That is, where does the legacy sort of reside? I think you're answering some of it. Sadly, there's no natural place for some of this to officially reside. But what of like today's fast pitch, right? I do know that there was something that the Chicago Bandits of National Pro Fastball, that NPF, right? I think that's it.
Yes.
That kind of had a bit of a throwback kind of game or memory to. I wonder where that connection is, because it seems like it's maybe needs to be made more, that not only the National League but the All-American League has a relationship with both the NPF and Athletes United, which is Athletes Unlimited, sort of a new effort to professionalize women's sports on a bunch of different levels, including quote unquote softball as we know it today. Is there a direct connection? Could there be more connections made and or history brought back, if you will, to kind of connect the past with the fledgling stillness of professional softball for women today?
Well, when the throwback game with the Chicago Bandits was made, I was working for the Chicago Bandits at the time, so that was why that they did that. I totally...
you buried the lead. You're the reason. When was that? 2000?
So that was 2012.
2012.
So honestly, I had seen an article where they had one of the former NGBL players throw out the first pitch at one of their games. So I kind of went to them really on a research level to try to get me in contact with that player. And, then they mentioned to me, we have this internship, and a lot of, what could we do to try to kind of foster this connection, between these players from the past and, your Bandits organization. And so the idea came up of having a turn back the clock game similar to what baseball does. So really, I kind of took the internship. I worked on that game, trying to get former players from the NGBL together. The Bandits were so accommodating, trying to get uniforms created and, just trying to help me with, whatever research they could give me or getting in contact with people that I wouldn't normally have the means to get in contact with. So that was kind of a perfect storm of, two people in need kind of getting together to try to, create something for these modern fans to kind of be like, oh, you know what, that's cool. We have, this connection with the past now, and maybe we can make this an annual thing.
Well,
and really,
there's also the collegiate game. I was watching some of the regional action last couple of days of the softball tournament for the NCAA, and it's an amazing array of talent. I mean, there have to be dozens of schools that are playing Division I. All right, so the whole idea of the quote unquote modern game, whether it be at the collegiate level or at the still fledgling professional level, and even Olympics too, right? Which when it shows up in the Olympics, I think it's going to stick around now again. It just begs for, I think, what came before. Like, how did this level of just of pervasiveness? It didn't come out of nowhere, right? There were people and pioneers prior to all this. God forbid you could remember or know some of that.
Yeah, and like I said, from the beginning, women were embraced in this sport, which is why I feel, in some ways you can honestly say softball might be a little bit superior to baseball in that regard, because, it was a sport for everybody. Now, whether or not, people like softball, though, in general, it can be debated. I don't think a lot of people, though, are seeing the sport. And so because of that, they come to it thinking that it is lesser than baseball. But I heard it said to me before, and I've heard it said by many people, once you see a women's softball game, you're hooked. And I've gotten a few of my friends and my family members hooked on softball, and it is a rather remarkable sport. And I feel, I call the age that the National Girls Baseball League existed and the time before that kind of like the golden age of women's softball. And then in 1956, when they started with the women's softball tournament, the World Softball Tournament, with, the United States playing against other countries, I think that kind of started a silver age, because there was a lot of independent amateur softball teams around the country that were still playing the game at a high level that you could almost call them professional level. And that kind of fostered, from 1956 to the 1970s, when women's softball kind of started gaining momentum in the NCAA, I think they were kind of the ones that kept it going. And then finally, when the NCAA adopted softball to today, that was really a huge thing, because I'm hearing now that NCAA women's softball is a revenue sport, and it's kind of unprecedented, that connection between baseball and softball. Now, women's basketball is a revenue sport, but they have the connection to the men. But women's softball was sort of independent of baseball. So the fact that they were able to accomplish being a revenue sport without baseball's help is rather remarkable.
Well, I think the fact that National Pro Fast Pitch has still hung on as long as it has, even though it's only 5-6 teams, and now has another professional, I wouldn't call it competitor, but it's a different model with this Athletes Unlimited, more sort of tournament and or even touring kind of based. I think that gives hope to the fact that this can be a professional path for some of the better NCAA players, should they choose to want to go into that direction. And Lord knows there's all kinds of video now opportunities, cable and streaming and stuff, to kind of maybe even bring some other additional revenue to it. So I'm a little bit more, well, I think you are too. I'm enthusiastic about the potential for it to, shall we say, rise again professionally. I just wonder, though, as that happens, and assuming that happens, and even the collegiate level, right, the explosion of popularity, people starting to want to look back, right? And I think that's an opportunity for, look to understand the histories, plural, behind, on the backs of pioneers come today's successes, right? We see this story over and over again. I got to think that history will come back in some way, shape, or form, be in vogue, right? I think there'll be, especially in Chicago, right, where this history is so rich, and the Midwest, where the All-American league was sort of out there. These are amazing stories, and I want to say everything old is new again, but these were pioneers, these players, and in many respects they could be celebrated once again as they pioneer once again in the modern sensibility of the game today.
Yes, and I also believe, too, statistically, I would love to see some of the women of today try to beat the records of some of these women that played in the past. Freda Savona really set the bar high when she played, but I believe, some of these players, if they had that statistical history, behind themselves, that, maybe that would give them even more incentive, to play their best because they have records that need to be broken in the professional ranks. And I also would love to see some sort of organization, whether it be like a Women's Softball Hall of Fame or a Women's Sports Foundation Hall of Fame or something like that, acknowledge a lot of these players in softball that play professionally, or even some of the barnstorming, women's sports teams like in basketball or in ice hockey that existed, before.
The Colorado Silver Bullets, remember them? They actually played,
yep.
Right? So it's all part of sort of that sort of bigger. All right, we've kept you long enough. Now's your chance to promote. How do people find this film? Where can they see it, and what else are you doing in and around it? And frankly, do you have other projects in mind too beyond this?
Well, the International Women's Baseball Center has been a huge help in trying to promote me and what I'm doing. So you can honestly visit their International Women's Baseball Center webpage. I believe it's internationalwomensbaseballcenter.org is their address. Or you could visit the website for my documentary film, which is National Girls Baseball League, all one word.com. And the documentary, unfortunately, the documentary is unfinished, so it hasn't been put out yet. Hopefully, I'm able to change that soon. But once it is out there, I hope to do maybe the film festival circuit so I can, promote the movie and eventually get these ladies, the recognition that they deserve. Also, I believe the International Women's Baseball Center might be having a virtual conference. So I might be doing something for them specifically about women's baseball. So I would probably do something about the American Girls Baseball Conference, which is the other league I mentioned that existed during the 40s and 50s. So hopefully I can put something together for them so you guys can also hear about this other league. And then really, just I want people to spread the word about the league. And, maybe I could get a few family members who hadn't heard about my project to hear your podcast, and maybe they could contact me and let me know, some of their stories about some of the players that I haven't been able to talk to. So that is another way that you guys can, hopefully help me, or, I can eventually help them with trying to get the stories told. But as far as that, other than that, I'm pretty much devoted simply to this project. I'm still doing a lot of research. I'm still trying to hunt down footage. So if anyone out there has footage or, really anything, photos, stories, I'd love to hear from you.
All right. Our thanks to Adam. And let's get a lot of sort of descriptional stuff out of the way, because I'm sure a bunch of you are going to be interested in going much, much deeper into this story as we indeed began to do in our little chat, hence concluded. First of all, that clip that you heard at the beginning of the proceedings was from Chicago Tonight. That's the evening newscast on local public television station here in Chicago, WTTW, featuring Jeffrey Bear, who has a long-running segment there called Ask Jeffrey. And that question, of course, came from Eva Dougherty, I think it was, of Chicago, asking about this league, and I think sort of tipped everything off into that segment and then some. Adam's film that was referenced in that clip that we talked about extensively is still in process. It's called Their Turn at Bat. And I'm sure it's going to be an opus once it's completed. But if you'd like to follow and or communicate with Adam and the progress of that film, perhaps even contribute to its production and hopefully release ultimately very soon, you can go to his website at National Girls Baseball League, all one word, nationalgirlsbaseballleague.com. Lots of great stuff, some clips there, various sort of updates and stuff. You can also follow Adam's exploits for this documentary on Twitter at NBGL Documentary, at NBGL Documentary on Twitter. And what else? You can also follow us, why not, on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You can follow us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You can follow us on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. You can follow us on our website as well, which is called goodseatsstillavailable.com. See what I did there? You can send us email at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can subscribe to our weekly email newsletter, which is discoverable on our website. Don't ask me where. It's just that you got to find it. But once you do, you will just need to enter your name and add email address, and you're good to go. We'll put you on the list. What else? Thanks to Jerry Payne, of course, for his efforts this week. We really put him through his paces for sure this time around, and we appreciate it to no end. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence, and we appreciate you, of course, for listening all the way through, as we love you to do each and every week. And until next week, we bid you a fond adieu. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then. Bye.